Anatomy of the Brain, produced and arranged by Professor Emeritus Dr. Meechai Srisai, Dr. Chatchanan Doungkamchan, Dr. Tanat Tabtieang, and Mr. Weerachai Kongwan, Department of Anatomy, Faculty of Medicine, Chulalongkorn University, Bangkok, Thailand. Let's begin with the median sagittal section of the skull. This is the median sagittal section of the skull showing cranial cavity, which is about 1,400 milliliters in average. Its main content is the brain. The median sagittal section of the head showing the brain, which is its major content. The brain is supported and protected by the skull and the scalp. The whole brain is covered by the meninges. The outermost layer is the dura mater. Note also its major blood supply from the middle meningeal vessels. The outermost layer of the meninges is a tough fibrous membrane called the dura mater. The intermediate layer is a thin transparent sheet called arachnoid membrane. The innermost layer is a very thin membrane adhered to the outer surface of the brain called the pia mater. The brain is covered by the dura mater and arachnoid membrane. On the anterior part of the brain, arachnoid granulations are related to the superior sagittal sinus, where cerebrospinal fluid is absorbed into the systemic circulation. On the posterior part of the brain, 3 layers of the meninges are shown from the innermost to the outermost layer respectively, the pia mater, the arachnoid membrane, and the dura mater. The brain is composed of cerebral cortex, diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. This tabulation shows adult structures and derivatives of brain corresponding to their embryonic origins. The forebrain or prosencephalon develops into telencephalon and diencephalon. The cerebral cortex and basal ganglia are derived from the telencephalon. The cavity in the telencephalon is lateral ventricle. The epithalamus, dorsal thalamus, ventral thalamus, and hypothalamus are derived from the diencephalon. Third ventricle is the cavity in the diencephalon. The midbrain or mesencephalon develops into midbrain. The narrow space in the midbrain is called cerebral aqueduct. The hindbrain or rhombencephalon develops into 2 parts, the metencephalon and myelencephalon. Derivatives from the metencephalon are pons and cerebellum. Derivative from myelencephalon is medulla or medulla oblongata. The cavity in the metencephalon and myelencephalon is called fourth ventricle. Now we look more deeply into each part of the brain, starting from the cerebral cortex. The cerebrum is divided by the longitudinal fissure into left and right cerebral hemisphere. Note the shallow groove is called sulcus, the deep groove is called fissure, and the convolution of the brain is called gyrus. The median sagittal section of the brain shows the falx cerebri, which lies deep in the longitudinal fissure and separates the left and right cerebral hemisphere. Both hemispheres are interconnected by the corpus callosum. In the median sagittal plane, observe the diencephalon, midbrain, pons, medulla, and cerebellum. Let's look at the lobes of the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is divided mainly into 4 lobes by the central sulcus, lateral or sylvian fissure, and an imaginary line drawn from the parietal occipital fissure to the preoccipital notch. The frontal lobe lies anterior to the central sulcus and superior to the sylvian fissure. The parietal lobe lies posterior to the central sulcus, superior to the sylvian fissure, and anterior to the imaginary line. The temporal lobe lies inferior to the sylvian fissure and anterior to the imaginary line. The occipital lobe lies posterior to the imaginary line. This is the demonstration of the major cortical areas of the cerebral cortex: prefrontal cortex, precentral gyrus or primary motor cortex, Broca's area, post-central gyrus or somatosensory cortex, primary visual cortex, and Wernicke's area. On the medial surface of the left cerebral hemisphere, the central sulcus, parietal occipital fissure, calcarine fissure, and collateral sulcus are located. Observe part of the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. Then compare with the right half of the cerebrum. On the medial surface of the right cerebral hemisphere, again, the central sulcus, parietal occipital fissure, and calcarine fissure are located. Observe parts of the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. On the lateral surface of the right half of the cerebral hemisphere, the central sulcus, parietal occipital fissure, and lateral fissure are located. From this view, observe again parts of the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. There are 2 more lobes which lie deep to the cerebral cortex, the insular lobe and the limbic lobe or the limbic system. A deep dissection through the operculum of the cerebral cortex is done in order to identify the insular lobe. The insular lobe lies just superior to the superior temporal gyrus and anterior to the transverse temporal gyri. The limbic structures are located on the medial margin or limbus of the cerebral hemisphere. Its components include septal area, cingulate gyrus, isthmus of cingulate gyrus, parahippocampal gyrus, and uncus. A deep and extensive dissection through the left cerebral hemisphere to identify structures of the limbic system is done in order to identify amygdala, hippocampus, fimbria, fornix, and mammillary body. A superior dissection from the top of the cerebrum is performed to expose inferior horn of the lateral ventricle and identify hippocampus and fornix. On the ventral surface of the brain, identify the olfactory structures, including olfactory bulb, olfactory tract, medial and lateral olfactory stria, medial and lateral olfactory areas, and anterior perforated substance. Now let's move on to the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia are subcortical nuclei of the telencephalon, which includes caudate nucleus and lenticular nucleus composing of putamen and globus pallidus. The left cerebral hemisphere dissected from the medial side shows the caudate nucleus in the lateral ventricle. The caudate nucleus is a C-shaped structure coursing rostally and superiorly to the diencephalon in the lateral ventricle. A lateral dissection of the cerebrum deep to the insular cortex to identify lenticular nucleus just inferior to the corona radiata or stratum semiovale of the cerebral cortex. In a coronal section through the rostral part of the brain, identify the caudate nucleus medial to the anterior limb of the internal capsule, and laterally to this nerve bundle, identify the putamen. The cavity of the brain at this level is the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. We still focus at the basal ganglia. A coronal section of the brain through the level of the encephalon shows the caudate nucleus and lenticular nucleus. Note the lenticular nucleus is composed of the outer segment called putamen and the inner segment called globus pallidus. The lenticular nucleus is separated from the medially located dorsal thalamus by the posterior limb of the internal capsule. In horizontal section of the brain, the caudate nucleus lies medial to the anterior limb of the internal capsule and lateral to the body of the lateral ventricle. The lenticular nucleus lies laterally to the posterior limbs of the internal capsule. Now let's focus at the diencephalon. We begin with the boundary of the diencephalon. This is the median sagittal section of the brain showing diencephalon, which is located between the cerebral cortex and the midbrain. Diencephalon is bounded anteriorly by the lamina terminalis, posteriorly by a line joining posterior commissure to the mammillary body, and superiorly by the fornix and inferiorly by the optic chiasma and the median eminence. The midline cavity of the diencephalon is the third ventricle. The diencephalon is composed of habenula, pineal body, dorsal thalamus, and hypothalamus. The dorsal thalamus is separated from the hypothalamus by the hypothalamic sulcus. The horizontal section through the diencephalon shows dorsal thalamus, which lies medial to posterior limbs of the internal capsule. The space between two thalami is third ventricle, which communicates with lateral ventricle through the foramen of Monro. Coronal section of the diencephalon through the level of optic chiasm. The dorsal thalamus is separated from the hypothalamus by hypothalamic sulcus. The space between the two thalami is the third ventricle. Coronal section of the diencephalon shows dorsal thalamus, which lies medial to the posterior limb of the internal capsule. The subthalamic nucleus is located ventral to the dorsal thalamus. Note also the amygdala and hippocampus in the temporal lobe. Dorsal surface of the forebrain shows the caudate nucleus and dorsal thalamus separated by sulcus terminalis. Now we move on to the brainstem. Median sagittal section of the brain shows the brainstem, which is composed of midbrain, pons, and medulla. Then we look particularly into the part of the midbrain. Median sagittal section through the midbrain shows the superior colliculus, inferior colliculus, and cerebral peduncle. The narrow space in the midbrain that communicates the third ventricle and fourth ventricle is the cerebral aqueduct. Ventral surface of the midbrain at the interpeduncular fossa shows the oculomotor nerve exiting the base of the midbrain close to the uncus of the temporal lobe. Dorsal surface of the midbrain shows tectum of superior colliculus and tectum of inferior colliculus. Ventral surface of the midbrain and pons shows the cerebral peduncle, superior pontine sulcus, basal pons, brachium pontis, and inferior pontine sulcus. Now we move downward to pons. This demonstration shows ventral surface of the basal pons and the cranial nerve, including trigeminal nerve, abducens nerve, facial nerve, and vestibulocochlear nerve. Dorsal surface of the pons between the anterior medullary velum and anterior margin of the striae medullaris shows brachium conjunctivum, medial eminence, brachium pontis, vestibular area, facial colliculus, and dorsal median sulcus. Now we continue moving downward onto medulla. This is the demonstration of the ventral surface of the medulla showing the restiform body, olive, pyramid, ventral median fissure, and motor decussation. Ventral surface of pons and medulla shows abducens nerve, facial nerve, vestibulocochlear nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve, vagus nerve, and hypoglossal nerve. Structures at the dorsal surface of the medulla include vestibular area, sulcus limitans, vagal trigone, striae medullaris, restiform body, hypoglossal trigone, area postrema, and obex. Now we move on to the last section, the cerebellum. This is the picture of the lateral surface of the whole brain, which includes cerebrum, brainstem, and cerebellum. Note the position of the cerebellum relative to brainstem and cerebrum. Now let's pay attention to the cerebellum. Median sagittal section of the brain shows the relation among midbrain, pons, medulla, and cerebella vermis. Note the cerebellum, pons, and medulla occupying the posterior cranial fossa. The cerebellum lies underneath the tentorium cerebelli. The space among the cerebellum and parts of the brainstem is fourth ventricle. Dorsal surface of midbrain and cerebellum shows the trochlear nerve exiting the dorsal surface of the midbrain. Cerebellum is divided into anterior lobe and posterior lobe by the primary fissure. The central part of the cerebellum is called cerebella vermis, whereas its lateral expansions are called cerebella hemispheres. At the posterior aspect of the cerebellum, the midline cerebella vermis and its lateral expansion, the cerebella hemispheres, are shown. Note the cerebellar tonsil is closely related to the medulla. Ventral surface of the medulla and pons shows the flocculus separating from the cerebellar hemispheres by the posterolateral fissure. Note the facial and vestibulocochlear nerve at this cerebellopontine angle. Median sagittal section through the brainstem and cerebellum shows the cerebella vermis, which is divided into anterior lobe and posterior lobe by the primary fissure. The nodulus is a part of the flocculonodular lobe. The space between the cerebellum and brainstem is called fourth ventricle. This is the end of the lecture, Anatomy of the Brain. We also have quizzes provided in the next section. Proceed and see how many you can answer correctly.